From Kentucky.
There comes a time in the history of nations when fear and complacency allow power to accumulate and liberty and privacy to suffer. That time is now, and I will not let the PATRIOT Act, the most unpatriotic of acts, go unchallenged. At the very least, we should debate. We should debate whether or not we are going to relinquish our rights or whether or not we are going to have a full and able debate over whether or not we can live within the Constitution or whether or not we have to go around the Constitution. The bulk collection of all Americans' phone records all of the time is a direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. The Second Appeals Court has ruled it illegal. The President began this program by executive order. He should immediately end it through executive order. For over a year now, he has said the program is illegal, and yet he does nothing. He says, well, Congress can get rid of the PATRIOT Act. Congress can get rid of the bulk collection, and yet he has the power to do it at his fingertips. He began this illegal program. The court has informed him that the program is illegal. He has every power to stop it, and yet the president does nothing. Justice Brandeis wrote that the right to be left alone is the most cherished of rights, most prized among civilized men. The Fourth Amendment incorporates this right to privacy. The Fourth Amendment incorporates this right to be left alone. When we think about the bulk collection of records, you might ask, well, maybe I'm willing to give up my freedom for security. Maybe if I just give up a little freedom, I'll be more safe. Well, most of the information that comes on whether you're safe or not comes from people who have secret information that you're not allowed to look at. So you have to trust the people. You have to trust those in our intelligence community that they're being honest with you. That when they tell you how important these programs are and that you must give up your freedoms, you must give up part of the Fourth Amendment, when they tell you this, you have to trust them. The problem is that we're having a great deal of difficulty trusting these people. When James Clapper, the head of the intelligence agency, the director of national intelligence, was asked point blank, are you collecting the phone records of Americans in bulk? He said no. It turns out that that was dishonest. And yet President Obama still has him in place. So when they say, oh, how important these programs are and how they're keeping us safe from terrorists, we're having to trust someone who lied to a congressional committee. It's a felony to lie to a congressional committee, and nothing has been done about this. So about a year ago, we began having this debate because a whistleblower came forward and said, here is a warrant for all of the phone records from Verizon. And you say, well, maybe they had evidence that people at Verizon were doing something wrong. There's no evidence. They want everyone's phone records. I don't have a problem with going after terrorists and getting their records, but you should call a judge. You should say the name of the terrorist and you get their records as much as you want. If I'm the judge and they ask me for the Tsarnaev boys' records, the Boston bomber, the Russians had investigated him. He'd gone back to Chechnya, and yet nobody even asked for a warrant to look at his stuff. We didn't even know he went back to Chechnya, and then we had the disaster of the Boston Marathon. I would make the argument that we spend so much time getting the haystack bigger and bigger and bigger that we can't find the needle because the haystack's too darn big. And we keep making it bigger and bigger, and we're taking resources away from the human analyst who should be looking and seeing when Tsarnaev travels outside of our country. We recently had another terrorist travel from Phoenix to Texas. We had arrested him previously. My guess is there was sufficient cause, probable cause, for a real warrant to look at his activities, and we should. But I don't think we're any safer looking at every American's records. In fact, when this came up, the government said, well, we've captured 52 terrorists because of this. But then when the president's own privacy commission looked at all 52 of them, there was a debate about maybe whether one had been aided, but not found by these records and would have been found by other records. We have to decide as a country whether we value our Bill of Rights, whether we value our privacy, or whether we're willing to give that up to feel safer. Because I'm not even sure you really can argue that we are safer, but people will argue that they feel safer. But think about it. Is the standard to be, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, but that everything should be exposed to the government, that all of your records can be collected? Now, some will say these are just boring old business records. Why would you care if they could find out who you called and how long you spoke on the phone? Well, 2 Stanford students did a study of this. They got an app, and they put the app on the phone voluntarily for 500 people. And these people then made phone calls, and all they looked at was how long they spoke, metadata, and who they spoke to, the phone number they were connected to. And what they found is that without any other information, 85% of the time they could tell what their religion was. More than 70% of the time, they could tell who their doctor was. They could tell what medications they took. They could tell what diseases they had. The government shouldn't have the ability to get that information unless they have suspicion, unless they have probable cause that you've committed a crime. The appeals court, when they looked at this, was flabbergasted that the government would make the argument that this was somehow relevant to an investigation, because that's what the standard is. Under the Constitution, the standard is probable cause, which means there's some evidence or suspicion that you've done something illegal. But the standard now is relevance, which means, is it relevant to an investigation? But the court said even that looser standard of relevance, they said it completely destroys any meaning of any words if we're going to say every American's phone record in the whole country is somehow relevant to an investigation. But it gets worse. They don't even have to prove it. The government says to the court that they think it's relevant. But there is no challenge, there is no debate, it's just taken at face value. Or at least it was until this court ruling was appealed. So you now have the second appeals court that said this bulk collection of phone records is illegal. There are many different programs going on. This is the only one we know about that our government is collecting our records, and the only reason we know about it is not because the government was honest with you, the government was dishonest. The Director of National Intelligence tried to basically lie to the American people and say it didn't exist. So we know about this one, but what other programs are out there? There's something called Executive Order 12333. There are some who believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg, the bulk collection, that there's an enormous amount of data being collected on people through this other program. One question is, if there is no Fourth Amendment protection to your records, are they collecting your credit card bills? I don't know the truth of that. I would sure like to know. I don't know whether to trust their answer if I ask them, if they'll be honest with us, to say, are they collecting our credit card records? And people might say, well, your credit card records are just boring old business records. Why would you care? But think about it. If the government has your Visa bill, they can tell whether you drink, whether you smoke, what restaurants you go to, what is your reading material, what magazines or books do you read, what doctors do you see, what medicines do you buy, do you buy medicine, do you gamble? All of these things can be determined. Not only can they determine stuff directly from your phone bill and directly from your Visa bill, they now have the ability to merge all of this information. Apparently, they have the ability to collect your contact list, and sometimes they're collecting this in a way that's somewhat nefarious. We're supposed to be spying on foreigners that might attack us, and I'm all for that. But what happens is there's a lot of data that goes in and out of the country, In fact, sometimes an email from New Jersey to Colorado might go through a server in Brazil. Once it gets to a server in Brazil, they can not only look at your metadata, how long and who you talk to, the content is now available. It all gets scooped up. It's all being analyzed. They're doing the social network of who your friends are. Some have said that this could potentially have a chilling effect on the First Amendment. There was a time in our country, not too long ago, in the lifetime of most of us, when if you had called the NAACP, that you might not want your neighbors to know. If you were a member of the NAACP, you might not want your neighbors to know. If you were calling the ACLU or a member of the ACLU, you might not want your neighbors to know. It can have a chilling effect on your expression of your speech, who you associate with, and whether or not you are fearful to have association with people because you're fearful that that knowledge might be known by the government. People say, well, certainly that would never happen. During the civil rights era, many of the civil rights leaders were spied upon illegally by the government through illegal wiretaps. Many Vietnam War protesters were also spied upon illegally by the government. The reason we have the Fourth Amendment is to have checks and balances. Everything that's great about our country are checks and balances. So when let's say you have a rapist or a murderer in Washington, D.C. today, and let's say it's 3 in the morning and the police come to the house and they think the rapist or murderer is inside. They don't just break the door down. If there's no commotion or no noise or no imminent danger, they stand outside and they get on their cell phone and they call the judge. And almost always the judge grants a warrant and then the police go in. But why do you want that to happen? Sometimes people will come up to me and they say, I'm a policeman or I work for the FBI. Many of my friends are policemen in the FBI, and they say, don't you trust us? It isn't about the individual. Laws aren't about whether we trust one person or your brother's a policeman and your brother would never do any wrong. It's not about your brother. It's not about your friend. It's about the potential for there being a rotten apple, someone who would take that power and abuse their power. We have laws, not for most of us. It's for the exception. It's for the something out of the ordinary. But it's also to prevent systemic bias from entering into the situation. So, for example, there was a time in the South when it might have been that a white person from the government might have decided they were going into the home of a black person just because of racial bias. You get rid of bias by having checks and balances, by always saying you have to ask somebody else for permission. When we were leading up to the war for our independence, in about 1761, I believe, James Otis was arguing before the courts, and he was arguing against something called writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were a type of warrant, but they were a generalized warrant. No one's name was on there. They just said, you're welcome to search anybody's house to make sure that they're paying for the stamp tax. You wonder why the colonists hated the stamp tax? It wasn't just the tax. It was the fact that the government could break the door down, come in, and rifle through their papers. Writs of assistance were something called a general warrant. This same battle had gone on in common law in England and developed as one of our precious rights that we actually kept from the English tradition. John Adams wrote about James Otis fighting against these general warrants, and he said that it was the spark that led to the American Revolution. This is how important this is. The Fourth Amendment was a big, big deal to our founders. The right to privacy, as Justice Brandeis said, the most cherished of rights, is a big, big deal. We shouldn't be so fearful that we're willing to relinquish our rights without a spirited debate. The debate over the Patriot Act, which enshrines all of this and got this started, goes on about every 3 years or so. It has a sunset provision. It is set to expire in the next few days. But we are mired in a debate over trade. There's another debate over the highway bill, And the word is we won't get any time to actually debate whether or not we're going to abridge the Fourth Amendment, whether or not we're going to accept something that one of the highest courts in our land has said is illegal. Are we going to accept that without any debate? I, for one, say that there needs to be a thorough debate, a thorough and complete debate about whether or not we should allow our government to collect all of our phone records all of the time. In England, about the time of James Otis, there was another man by the name of John Wilkes. And I learned about this story in reading my colleague, Senator Lee's book recently. John Wilkes was a rabble-rouser. He was a dissenter. Some called him a libertine. I don't know about his morals, but I know he wasn't afraid of the king. And the king was becoming more and more powerful at that time. It was one of the complaints that we had as well. And so John Wilkes began his own newspaper, and it was called the North Briton, and he labeled the numbers. And the one at this time became the North Briton number 45. It became so famous throughout England that it was also part of our idiom, part of our language in the United States. Everybody knew what 45 was if you mentioned it. But he wrote something about the king. He basically wrote what would be an op-ed in our day, and he made the mistake of sort of saying that the king's behavior, the prime minister's behavior, was the equivalent to prostitution. This did not make the king very happy. And so the king wrote out a warrant for the arrest of anybody that had to do with the writing of this North Briton number 45. But the warrant didn't have anybody's name on it. It was a generalized warrant. He said, arrest anybody. So they broke down John Wilkes's door. They rifled through and ruined the contents of his house, arrested him, put him in irons, and took him to the Tower of London. They did the same to 49 other people. But John Wilkes wasn't about to take this lying down, so John Wilkes actually then decided that he would sue the king. I tried doing the same thing, but I tried suing the president, and it hasn't gone so well. But the thing is that everybody ought to think that they have the ability and the equality to sue even our leaders. So he sued the king, but something remarkable happened. This is in the early 1760s. When he sued the king, he actually won. I think the award was like £1,000, which would be a significant sum of money for us in today's terms. But it was a big victory. It was part of the discussion going on simultaneously over here with James Otis. It was a big, big deal. So often, my party, we do such a great job talking about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and I'm all for that. But the thing is I don't think you can adequately protect the Second Amendment unless you protect the Fourth Amendment. The right to privacy, the right to, in your house is your castle, the right to not have your castle invaded is so important. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, a lot of people think we'll be safer if we collect gun records. So they collected all the gun records and they had them in Westchester County near New York City. But then a newspaper decided they would just publish them. They really didn't think this through, but you can see the danger of what happens when the government has records and then releases them to everybody. Imagine if you're a woman who's been abused or beaten by her husband, has left him, she lives in fear of him finding her, and now the registration comes out and says where she lives and that she has a gun, or worse yet, where she lives and that she doesn't have a gun. Think of our prosecutors and our judges. I know many of them who put bad people away, and many of them have concealed carry. Many of them travel to work. The security meets them in the parking lot, and they go to work. But they worry. We've had sheriffs and we've had prosecutors killed in Kentucky because the criminals were angry they were locked up. We don't want all of our records by the government to be put out there in public for everybody to know where we live and whether we have a gun or not. So you can see why the issue of privacy is not a small issue. It is a big issue and was incredibly important to our founding fathers. Some have said it's too late. It's too late to even get this back. There have been articles written in the last few weeks that say whether the Patriot Act expires or not, the government will just keep on doing what they're doing. In fact, there's a provision in the Patriot Act that says any investigation already begun before the deadline can go on in perpetuity. The other thing is that there are people now writing. There was a John Napier Ty, who was the internet watchdog for this program, who wrote that he believes that the Executive Order 12333 is really allowing all this bulk collection under what the president says are Article 2 authorities. Now, Article 2 gives the president of the executive branch different powers, but these aren't unlimited powers. Some think they are. Some say the president has the absolute power when it comes to war. Well, actually, Article 2 comes after Article 1, and in Article 1, Section 8, the president was told that he doesn't get to initiate war. The most basic of powers with regard to war were not actually given to the president. They were given to Congress. What is sad about this, what's going on now, is that Congress hasn't shown, I think, sufficient interest in what the executive branch does on a host of things, whether it be regulation, whether it be the enormous bureaucracy. But really, so much power has shifted and gone from Congress and wound up in the executive. It's the same way with intelligence. We have intelligence committees, but the question is, are they asking sufficient questions? Now, there are some. Senator Wyden has been a leader in this, and he and I have worked together, but he's really been the leader because he's been on the Intelligence Committee, and he has more information, really, than the rest of us do. But he's at times been hamstrung because once you know information, if it's told to you in a classified setting, you're not allowed to talk about it. So sometimes it actually makes sense if you want to speak out, not to actually learn through the official channels, but to read on the internet, because if you learn about it through official channels, you can't say anything about it, even if the government is lying about it. We're talking about an enormous amount of information. We're talking about all of your phone records all of the time. Now, recently, there was some complaint by people in the newspaper, and they said, well, the government's really only getting a third of your records. They're not getting enough of your records. Some want them to get more of your records. The objective evidence shows, though, that we really have never gotten anyone independently. We've not found any terrorist independently of this. But still, some people are so fearful, they're like, how could we get terrorists? We'll be overrun with terrorists, and ISIS will be in every drugstore and in every house in America if we don't get rid of the Constitution, if we don't let the Fourth Amendment lapse, if we don't just let everybody pass out warrants. That's what we do under the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act allows the police to write their own warrants. This was one of the fundamental separations that we did with the Fourth Amendment. This was probably the most important thing we did, was to separate police power from the judiciary, to have a check and a balance so you would never get systemic bias, so you would never get political or religious or racial bias in your judicial system. We separated these powers. But we now let the police write their own warrants. It's a special form of police. It's the FBI, but they are domestic police. The FBI is allowed to write their own warrants. These are called national security letters, and they don't have to be signed by a judge. There is no probable cause. If they come into your house, there is no ability for you to complain. In fact, sometimes they're now coming into our houses without us knowing about it. This is called a sneak and peek warrant. And like everything else, the government says we'll be overrun with terrorists if we don't let the government quietly sneak into your house when you're not gone, when you are gone, and put listening devices, search through your papers, and read all of your stuff while you're gone. You don't have to have probable cause necessarily for these. It's a lower standard. But we're letting the FBI write this without a judge reviewing it. I have a good friend who's an FBI agent. I play golf with him. He's like, don't you trust me? And I do. I do trust him. but I don't trust everybody. Madison said that if government were comprised of angels, we wouldn't need restrictions, we wouldn't need laws. Patrick Henry said that the Constitution's about restraining the power of government. It isn't about the vast majority of good people who work in government. It's about preventing the bad apple. It's about preventing the one bad person that might get into government and decide to abuse the rights of individuals. Some say, well, the NSA has never abused anyone's rights. That may or may not be true. They're giving us the information. We don't get to independently look at the information. They're telling us. It's the same group that says they weren't doing any bulk collection of data at all. But even if we presume that they are telling us the truth, it isn't really the end of the story, because the story should be that we don't want to allow the abuse of power to happen. As the debate unfolded the first time for the Patriot Act, something occurred that happens frequently around here. There's not enough time. Hurry up, there's not enough time. It's kind of like the debate right now. The Patriot Act, I'm not sure, unless we insert ourselves at this moment, that we'll have any debate over it. It's been set to expire for 3 years. We've known it was coming. And the question is, do we not have enough time because we just don't care enough? We're going to relinquish our rights or constrict our rights through the Bill of Rights, even though we know it's coming up, that we have to do something else that occupies all of our time? Senator Wyden and I have a series of amendments. Our amendments would try to reform some of this. Our amendments would say that NSLs, national security letters, can't be just signed by the police, that they would have to go to a judge. And people argue, well, how would we catch terrorists? The same way we catch other people who are dangerous, murderers and rapists, and anybody in our society. In fact, when you look at the warrant process for criminal warrants, warrants are almost never turned down. But just that simple check and balance of having the police call a judge is one of the fundamental aspects of our jurisprudence. And we gave it up so quickly. We gave it up so quickly on the heels of 9/11 in the fear. But the thing is when the Patriot Act came forward, most people didn't even read it. There was a committee bill and this and that, and there was a last-minute substitution. It was given hours, and it was simply passed in a spate of fear. As we look at what happened at that time, I think we now have the ability to look backwards and say, is there another way? When we start with the doctrine that a man's house or a woman's house is their castle, it was a very old notion, maybe even dating back to the times of Magna Carta. Our castle now and our papers are a little bit different now. And the Supreme Court hasn't quite caught up to where we are technologically. They're getting there. But this really needs to be debated and discussed at the Supreme Court level. Because the thing is we don't keep our papers in our house anymore. In fact, we've gone to such a paperless society that 90% of your paper, or if you're under 30 years old, 100% of your paper is held somewhere else. But the question we have to ask is, do you retain a privacy interest in your records? When the phone company holds your records, do they have an obligation to keep them private? Do you retain a privacy interest? If the government wants the records from the phone company, should they be allowed to write the name Verizon and get all of the records for Verizon? I frankly think that if John Smith has his phone service with Verizon and he's a terrorist, the warrant should say John Smith and go to Verizon, but it's an individualized warrant. I don't think we should have generalized warrants. There are some who want to replace now the bulk collection of records with a different system, where the government doesn't hold the records, but the phone company holds the records. I'm also concerned about this. For one big reason, the recent court case has said now that the Patriot Act does not justify the collection of records, that it's actually illegal under that. I'm concerned that since the court is now saying that Section 215 doesn't allow bulk collection, that in trying to reform this, what's called the USA Freedom Act, but by trying to reform this, we actually will be granting new power to Section 215 that the court says is not there. The court is saying that it stands logic on its head to say that relevance means nothing, that everybody's record in the whole country could be relevant. We've even changed over time the investigations, whether or not there's a full-blown investigation, the beginning of an investigation. Who gets to decide or define what an investigation is? The bottom line is, though, as we look at this and as we move forward, we have to decide whether our fear is going to get the better of us. Once upon a time, we had a standard in our country that was innocent until proven guilty. We've given up on so much. Now people are talking about a standard that is, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Think about it. Is that the standard we're willing to live under? Think about whether or not your records, as held by the credit card companies, your bank, or the phone company, whether you believe that you still have a privacy interest in these. In the PATRIOT Act, they did something to make it easier to collect records and to override your privacy agreement. If you read the nitty-gritty of any of these agreements that you have when you use a search engine or when you're on the internet, you do voluntarily say that your information will be shared in an anonymous way, but they promise that they're not giving your name to somebody. Phone company has the same sort of privacy arrangements, privacy agreements. But what has happened is, through the PATRIOT Act, we've given them liability protection. And at first blush, you might say, well, we have too many damn lawsuits. I'm kind of that way. I'm a physician. We got way too many lawsuits. I'm for cutting back on lawsuits. But at the same time, if you give the phone company or the internet company or the credit card company immunity to ignore your privacy agreement, they will. So the new system is, instead of the government storing billions and billions of records in Utah, we're still going to store billions and billions of records in the phone company, but still the question is, will we access them in a general way? It says we're going to do a specific person, but if you look where a person is defined, a person could be a corporation. I don't think you should have a warrant that says Verizon and gets all the records for all of their customers. The other thing that's been going on, they haven't been completely honest with, and we may have some data on, is that the government is going inside of the software. They're asking people like Facebook, or demanding people like Facebook, that they give them access through their source codes so the government can get in. Now, to Facebook's credit, Facebook is fighting them, and I think more companies now are standing up and trying to fight against this. But the government is going in a nefarious way into the code of Facebook and then inserting malware into other people's Facebook and spreading it throughout the internet. The government also is looking at communication between two nodes. So let's say you communicate with Google and it's encrypted, but then when Google has a data center that talks to another data center, there's a place in which it's non-encrypted, and the government's just simply hooking up to the cable and siphoning off records. There is a danger that you'll have no privacy left in the end of this. The Fourth Amendment's very specific. The Fourth Amendment says you have to individualize a warrant. You have to put a name on the warrant. You have to say specifically what records you want. You have to say where they're located, and then you have to ask a judge for permission. The sneak and peek warrants that I was talking about before is Section 213. It's now permanent law. We don't even get a chance to talk about it. We could repeal it, and I will have an amendment to repeal it. This is where the government goes in secretly. And they say, well, we need this lower standard because terrorists will get us if we don't. Well, we've now had it on the books for a decade, and you know who they're getting? Drug people. People either buying, selling, or using drugs. That's a domestic crime. Which also leads me to something else about the PATRIOT Act that really bothers me, is that when we first started talking about the standards, going from probable cause, which is what the Constitution has, to articulable suspicion down to relevance, we said, well, we're going to lower standards because we're going after foreigners. They're not Americans and they're not here. We're going to lower the standard. And really, there can be some debate in favor of that. When we first did it, though, we said that you couldn't use that information for a domestic crime. And I'll give you sort of the example. And I asked one of the intelligence folks at one time to answer this and was dissatisfied with the response. Let's say the government comes in through a sneak and peek warrant. They don't tell you, they're in your house. They find out, guess what, you're not a terrorist, but you have paint in your house that you bought through your office, business expense, and you're painting your house at home, which is a tax violation. It's a domestic crime, but they got into your house through false pretenses. They said you were a terrorist. They just were wrong, but they found out that you're not being perfectly honest with your taxes. But they've gotten into a lower standard. And so ultimately, if we let them collect all of your records and we let domestic crime be prosecuted by this, we could have the government sifting through your credit card records, because they say the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect records, or your phone records, not the content, just all of this data, putting it together and meshing it and deciding that maybe you're somebody who runs traffic lights by your footprint, your digital footprint. The thing is now we're then taking something that was intended to capture foreigners, and we're going to capture people domestically and prosecute them for domestic crime. The specific thing they promised us never to do. So things morph and they get bigger and bigger. We can have a valid debate about whether we've gone too far, but we ought to at least have a debate. Shouldn't we get together and say, let's have a debate, let's devote a week to this? I've been asking for a while to have a full day and have 5 or 6 amendments that Senator Wyden and I could put forward and have a full-fledged debate over whether or not the bulk collection of our records is something we should continue to do. Now, I think if you look at this and you say, where are the American people on this? Well, there's been poll after poll. Well over half of the people, maybe well over 60% of the people, think the government's gone too far. But if you want an example of why the Senate or Congress doesn't represent the people very well, or why we're maybe a decade behind, I'll bet you it's 20% of the people here would vote to stop this, to truly just stop it, at the most. Whereas it's 60, 70% of the public would stop these things. You're not well represented. What's happened is that I think the Congress is maybe a decade behind the people. I think this is an argument for why we should limit terms. I think it's an argument for why we should have more turnover in office, because we get up here and we stay too long and we get separated from the people. The people don't want the bulk collection of their records. And if we were listening, we'd hear that. The vote in the House, while I don't think the bill is perfect, and I think it may well continue bulk collection, was over 300 votes to end this program, to say we're no longer going to have bulk collection. And yet it looks like the majority in this body still says we need bulk collection. In fact, the biggest complaint from the majority in this body is we're not collecting enough records, that we need to collect more records. Can you have security and liberty at the same time? I had breakfast with a high-ranking official from our intelligence community, maybe 6 months ago, and I asked him, how much information do you get from metadata, and how much do you end up getting from a warrant? He says, without question, you get more from a warrant. People talk about whether we can go 1 hop or 2 hop. That means if you're suspected of terrorism and you called 100 people, if we look at your records, that's 1 hop. If we look at the records of the next 100, that's a 2nd hop. So as you go in, this pyramid gets bigger and bigger until you're talking about tens of thousands of people. But as you're getting farther and farther away from the suspect, I see no reason why you couldn't keep getting warrants. If they say the warrants are slow and laborious and there's not a judge, put more judges on the court. If they say they need them at 3 in the morning, put the judges on 24-hour alert and you can call them at 3 in the morning. We do it every night all across America. We call judges for a warrant in the middle of the night. I see no reason why you can't have security and the Constitution at the same time. The president instituted it's called the Privacy and Civil Rights Board, and they went through a lot of this. And some of the things that they came up with, I think, were truly astounding. The amount of information, I think, is mind-boggling of what's being sucked up in this. There's something called Section 702 of FISA, and this has allowed them to collect information on Americans who might have been communicating with a foreigner. And you say, well, that American's probably suspicious. Well, it goes out in ripples, and it just becomes this enormous amount, this enormous cache of information. When they looked at some of this recently, the Washington Post looked at this, they found that 9 of 10 intercepted conversations were not the intended target. So I think there was one estimate that in the last year we had 89,000 targets. But if you multiply that and say that's only 1/10 of what we actually take, you're now looking at 900,000 records of people who had nothing to do with terrorism. Didn't even really talk to the person. They incidentally talked to a person who talked to the person. It could be the terrorist called Papa John's, and you've called Papa John's. You're now on the same phone tree network. So it can ripple out in ways. That information shouldn't be collected, it shouldn't be put in a database, and it shouldn't be stored. Because ultimately we're collecting so much information that it's all of your information. One thing that should concern us, going from a system where the government collects all these records and stores them in Utah to one where the phone companies are going to do it, is actually some people in the NSA are acquiescing in this and saying, not so bad. That concerns me if the NSA is saying not so bad. It concerns me that we're still going to have bulk collection. The debate we really need to have is whether or not your records, if someone else is holding them, if you still have any privacy, any kind of privacy interest in your records. I personally think that your phone records are still partially yours in a way, or that you have a privacy interest in them. This is going to become very important because your records, ultimately, there probably won't even be any records in your house. They're going to be on your phone. And then your phone records are connected to the company. Who owns them? Do you have a right to privacy in those records? I think you can have security and freedom at the same time. But I think if we're not careful, this is going to get away from us. When they found out that 9 out of 10 intercepts were actually not the intended target, just ancillary information that they'd picked up, they also found that 50% contained email addresses that were U.S. citizens. So let's say you collect 1 million pieces of information and you're just gathering this up and you're intended to go after foreign targets, it might be terrorists, but over half of this information, much of it incidentally gained, are actually U.S. citizens. So what this is it's sort of an end run. They call it backdoor searches, but it's sort of an end run that has gone around the Constitution, gone around the Fourth Amendment to collect information that we've actually said should be illegal to be collected that way, but we're doing it because we've done an end run around. Also realize that you can send an email from Virginia to South Carolina and it might go over a server in Brazil. If your email goes over a foreign server, all of a sudden, boom, everything's done, the Constitution's out the door, they can collect that, even the content. It's never revealed to you, nothing's ever presented to you, it's all done within the executive branch with no advocate on your side. There's several programs that came out through this that are being collected. It's not just the bulk collection. There's a program called PRISM that's been out there for a while, and there's another one called Upstream. In PRISM, it's a surveillance program that collects internet communications of foreign nationals from at least 9 major internet companies. Now, I think this wouldn't have happened if the internet companies were not given liability protection. I think what would have happened is they would have said, we're violating our obligation to our customer, and we're going to fight against this. But the Patriot Act even made it worse. The Patriot Act made it a crime to reveal that you'd been served with a warrant. So we've gone way beyond any typical constitutional mechanisms. In the upstream program, a similar thing happens, but this is when the data is collected as it moves across U.S. junctions. The problem is not so much going after foreign communications, but going after incidental and collecting incidental communications that involve American citizens. John Napier Tye was the section chief for the Internet Freedom in the State Department's Bureau of Democracy. He was going to give a speech, and I think this is very telling. This is reported in the Washington Post. And so he had written his speech out, and he sent it for review. In his speech, he said, if U.S. citizens disagree with congressional and executive determinations about the proper scope of intelligence activities, they have the opportunity to change policy through democratic process. And you'd think, who could object to that? What would his censors say? How could they possibly say that we don't have the right through democratic process to change policies? They had him strike through intelligence processes because I guess they apparently think that we don't have the democratic ability to change these things. And the sad truth is it may be true because a lot of this is being done by executive order. Executive Order 12333 has no congressional oversight. In fact, the question was asked recently of one of the Senate leaders, will you investigate this? Now, there may well be a secret investigation going on, but there was some indication that it was really outside of our purview. I don't think anything the executive branch does should be outside our purview. The whole idea of having co-equal branches was to have checks and balances. One of the biggest problems I find in Washington is that sometimes the opposition party, so if you have a Democrat president and a Republican Congress, you'll get a little bit of adversity and a little bit of pitting ambition against ambition and check and balance. But the party that is the same party as the president just doesn't tend to push back, probably for partisan reasons. Now, it's not just the other party. It happens when Republicans are in power also. What happens is the political party that's the same power as the president tends to sort of be open to letting things move on, just letting the president accumulate more power. But I think this should be telling that when he said we could change things through democratic action, President Obama's White House counsel told him that no, that wasn't true. He was instructed to amend the line and make a general reference to our laws and policies, but to leave out intelligence policies as if we don't really get a say in what they do as far as what information they collect from us. John Napier Tye goes on to warn us. He says that unlike Section 215, Executive Order 12333 authorizes collection of the content of communications, not just metadata, even for U.S. citizens. So quite often we're told, well, we were told for years, don't worry, they're not collecting your data, they're just collecting the data of foreigners. Turns out that wasn't true. Now the big thing that they tell us is, well, we're not collecting the content, we're just collecting the numbers. But when you read John Napier Tye, he says that the executive order authorizes collection of the content of the communications also, not just metadata, and also for U.S. persons. So the question is, if we get rid of bulk collection, will the executive continue to do it anyway? The other question is, why doesn't the executive stop this? It was started by executive action. It could be ended by executive action at any time. Where is the executive? How come the press give him a free pass just to say Congress needs to fix this. Sure, I messed it up. I broke it. I'm doing something that the Second Appeals Court said is illegal, and I'm going to keep on doing it until Congress does something. Why don't we see any questions from the press? Why don't we see anybody from the media saying, Mr. President, it's illegal. You started it. You are performing a program that is collecting all of the phone records from all Americans. It's been declared illegal from the second highest court in the land. Why don't you stop? I've not ever heard him ask the question. With the executive order, apparently, because this, they say, is Article 2, and that Article 2 to them means they can do whatever they want without any oversight by Congress, the conclusion by John Napier Tye is that there is nothing to prevent the NSA from collecting and storing all communications. This concerns me. The President instituted or brought together a group called the Review Group on Intelligence and Communication Technologies. And in it, they came forward with some recommendation. Recommendation number 12 was that all of this data, all this incidental data that's becoming part of these databases that is collected under these authorities, the executive order, should be immediately purged unless there is a foreign intelligence component to it. The review group further recommended that a U.S. person's incidentally collected data should never be used in a criminal proceeding against that person. So now we're back to what I was talking about earlier. If you're going to go away from the Constitution, if you're going to say to catch bad guys, we can't really have the Constitution, we're going to have a bar that's a lot easier to cross that allows us to do kind of what we want, wouldn't you want to exclude American citizens from being convicted or put in jail for a crime under a lower standard? It's kind of like this. The question is, if the government can come in without a valid search warrant, without announcing that they're in your house, collect all of your data, would you want them to have hours and hours in your house without any probable cause and then start arresting you for this? There are rumors that we are doing this. There are rumors that intelligence warrants, which are non-constitutional, which are at a lower standard, are being used to get regular criminals. What they do is collect information through data, metadata analysis, all of this. They get enough to be convinced that you're a drug dealer, then they arrest you by getting a traditional warrant, but they're using information that they got illegally to get to you. Section 213, this whole sneak and peek, where they go in without announcing that they've been in your house, 99.5% of the people arrested are actually people who've committed a domestic crime. They're not terrorists. So we're told you have to have the PATRIOT Act to get terrorists, and yet what we really find is that they're using it in a way that was not honest. They're using a lower standard, a standard less than the Constitution, and they're using that standard then to arrest people for basic domestic crime. The President's Review Commission, that in recommendation number 12, recommended that this incidentally collected data not be used criminally against anybody. They gave their recommendations to the White House. The White House stated that the adoption of these recommendations that they had requested would require significant changes, and indicated that it had no plans to make any changes. So the President's own Review Commission says there's great danger in using a lower, less than constitutional standard to collect great amounts of information that can be searched. There's great danger to privacy. There's also great danger to using information collected outside of the Constitution. There's great danger in then using that for domestic prosecution. And the President said he has no intention of any changes. When I think of this president, it's probably what disappoints me most. There were fleeting times when this president was in the U.S. Senate that he stood up for the Constitution. In fact, there's a quote from the president when he was running for office. There are many quotes, but there was one quote saying that the warrants that are issued by police, national security letters, should be signed by a judge. The very amendment that I will try to get a vote on, he seemed to have supported. But now his administration is issuing hundreds of thousands. Starts out with a few, 47, couple hundred. Now it's in the thousands. Anytime you give power to government, they love it and they will accumulate more. Anytime you give power to government and expect them to live within the confines of the power, they will not live within the confines of power unless you watch them. Like a hawk, you've got to watch them. You have to have oversight. We're at a point now where we have enormous bulk collection, enormous collection of American citizens' data. One program we know almost nothing about, and yet it goes on with no debate. The executive order from 1981 has been transformed into a monster with tentacles that reaches into every home in our country. The collection of records that is going on is beyond your imagination, and we need to know about it. There needs to be a public debate. It's become even more pressing that we have this public debate, because the problem is that you have the president and you have the Congress, and you have the intelligence community not being honest with us. So the fact that the Director of National Intelligence would come to Congress and lie and say they're not collecting this information, and then when they do admit to it, say, oh, but by the way, it's working really well and we're capturing all kinds of terrorists. But they hold all of the information, and we rely on them to be honest, to present truthful information to us. This is a big problem. Currently, the courts haven't, I think, brought their rulings up to date. The debate, though, has been going on for a long time. In 1928, there was the Olmstead case. The Olmstead case went against those of us who believe in privacy. And I believe that that case still lingers on, even though it's been reversed. In the Olmstead case, Ray Olmstead was a bootlegger. And the government decided to eavesdrop on his conversations, but they did it without a warrant. They could have gotten a warrant. Who knows why they didn't get the warrant, but they didn't get a warrant. But the court ended up ruling that phone conversations were not protected by the Fourth Amendment. This was a sad day in our history when this happened in 1928. The dissent in that case was Justice Brandeis. And as so often occurs in our history, sometimes the dissent becomes the majority opinion and becomes profound because it was there at the time. Harlan's opinion, dissent in Plessy v. Ferguson's the same way. It becomes what everybody refers to. Nobody refers to the majority in saying that separate is equal. They were wrong. Same way with the Olmstead case. People now remember Justice Brandeis, and it's probably one of the most famous quotes in jurisprudence, that the right to be left alone is the most cherished of rights, that it's the most valued among civilized men. We have this debate still sometimes, though, because some conservatives say, well, there is no right to privacy. I don't see it in the Constitution. Conservatives who argue there is no right to privacy aren't remembering the 9th and 10th Amendment very well, particularly the 9th Amendment. The 9th Amendment says that all the rights aren't listed, but those that aren't listed are not to be disparaged. Even our founding fathers worried about this. Our founding fathers came forward and they at first thought we'd do just the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. And some of them worried. They said, if we do the Bill of Rights, people will think that's all we have. That if we list 10 different amendments, they'll think that's all of our rights. And so they finally convinced everybody to go along with it by saying, we'll put in the 9th and 10th Amendments. The 10th Amendment limiting the powers and saying only the powers enumerated are given to the federal government. Everything else is left to the states and the people, respectively. But the 9th Amendment, which is in many ways sort of the stepchild of our amendments, hasn't been adequately, I think, adhered to or recognized. It says those rights not listed are not to be disparaged. Sometimes we have this discussion because some people say what has to be enumerated. Now, I agree completely if we're talking about the powers given to government should be enumerated. They're few and limited, the powers given to the government. But it's the opposite with your rights. Your rights are many and infinite. Your rights are unenumerated, and you do have a right to privacy. So while the word privacy is not in the Constitution, in the 4th Amendment, though, they do talk a lot about your privacy. It's about your home. It's about your home as your castle. The exact words of the 4th Amendment are the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person and things to be seized. The reason why we should worry about whether or not a warrant is individualized is we've had some tragic times in our history. During World War II, we didn't individualize the arrest of Japanese Americans. We didn't say, that is so-and-so who lives in California, and we think they are communicating with Japan and telling our secrets. We indiscriminately rounded up all of the Japanese and incarcerated them. There have been times in our history when we haven't acted in an individualized manner. It happened throughout the South, in the old Jim Crow South. We told people that we were going to relegate them to a certain status based on a general category. So when we talk about individualizing warrants, we're talking about trying to prevent bias from occurring. Now, bias can occur for a lot of different reasons. I tell people, you can be a minority because of the color of your skin or the shade of your ideology. You can be a minority because of your religion. You can be a minority because you homeschool. But the thing is that if you are a minority, if you are a dissenter, if you dissent from the majority, you need to be very, very aware of your constitutional rights. Very, very aware of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights isn't so much for the prom queen. The Bill of Rights isn't so much for the high school quarterback. Many people in life always seem to be treated fairly. The Bill of Rights is for those who are less fortunate, for those who might be a minority of thought, deed, or race. We have to be concerned about the individualization of our policies, or we run the risk. We run the risk and the danger of people being treated in categories. Right now, we're treating every American in one category. There is a general veil of suspicion that is placed on every American now. Every American is somehow said to be under suspicion because we're collecting the records of every American. When we talk about metadata and whether or not or how much it means and what the government thinks they can determine from metadata, the people who say don't worry, it's just your phone logs, it's no big deal, it's just boring old business records, should be a little bit concerned by the words of one former intelligence officer who said that we kill people based on metadata. Now, he wasn't referring to Americans, he's talking about terrorists. But we should be concerned that they are so confident of metadata that they would kill someone. So instead of us believing that metadata is no big deal and it just should be public information and anybody can have it, realize that your government is so certain of metadata that they would kill an individual over it. That seems to me to make the point that metadata is incredibly important if we would make a decision to kill someone based on their metadata. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has done a lot of work for privacy and deserves a lot of credit. Mark Jaycox writes in an issue from last year that it is likely that the NSA conducts much more of its spying power under the president's claimed inherent powers and only governed by a document originally approved by an executive order. So while we're superficially having a debate over the bulk collection of records that some claim were authorized under the PATRIOT Act, Section 215, there's a whole other section that some privacy advocates are worried about that's even bigger. I had a meeting recently with one of the founders of one of the huge social communication companies, and he told me that he thinks that we're missing some of the debate here, because he says everybody's talking about bulk collection of your phone records. He's convinced that there's ever so much more being collected through backdoor channels. These backdoor channels can occur in two ways. They can occur one way by going and looking at foreigners' information and then coming through the back door back into our country and looking at Americans' information. But then that American information has tentacles and spreads, and it becomes this enormous grouping of incidental information. In fact, some have said that it's 9 out of 10 pieces of data pulled in aren't about a terrorist, they're just incidental stuff. What the President's Review Commission said is we should delete that once we find it's not relevant to an investigation. The amazing thing to me is that even people who support the PATRIOT Act, and I don't, I think the PATRIOT Act lowers the constitutional standards and it risks our freedom and our liberty. But even for those who think the PATRIOT Act is fine, they say that the PATRIOT Act never was intended to do this. So if you want to ask yourself, is the government overstepping? Even the authors of the PATRIOT Act are now telling us that the overstepping is to such a degree that they think the PATRIOT Act doesn't justify it. In fact, that's really what the court ruled recently. I had hoped the court would rule that the bulk collection, the grabbing up of all your records, that it was unconstitutional, but they actually simply ruled that the PATRIOT Act does not sanction it. The PATRIOT Act does not give the authority to the government to do this. And so it's a pretty amazing sort of set of circumstances, is that the government has taken something that was intended in one way, completely transformed it, and then when they're rebuked by the court, they're not chastened at all. So I still wonder why no one has had the guts or the wherewithal to ask the president, why doesn't he stop this now? The president could today listen to this speech on the floor of the Senate, and he could change his mind. He could this afternoon, with his pen, he says he's got his pen and his cell phone, he could immediately stop the bulk collection of data. In fact, all of the alternatives he could probably do now. He could also say that he's going to collect the data with a warrant. He has all of that power. Someone should ask the president, Mr. President, why do you keep doing something the court has said is illegal? Why do you continue doing this, and why won't you stop? And how could we possibly think that it is a responsible answer to say, oh, I'll stop when they make me? His own privacy commission says that what he's doing is illegal and should stop. One of the things that people are worried about is that the government is forcing their way into the code source of different Facebook, Google, different internet companies. There's a couple of things that are occurring because of this. If you live in Europe, if you're Angela Merkel, or if you're anybody in Europe, you might not want American stuff anymore. So there are already rumors and discussion that billions of dollars, there's been some estimating over $100 billion has been lost to where we have been a dynamic leader in software and hardware, in the internet. People don't want our stuff because they don't trust us anymore. One of the reasons they don't trust us is this. We have a group called the Tailored Access Operation, targets system administrators and installs malware while masquerading as Facebook servers. That's a little scary, that you go on Facebook and somehow malware is getting into your computer and then searching and allowing them to know everything that you're doing on your computer. If you have a warrant, you can, to my mind, you can do a host of these things, but do it to someone you have suspicion of. I think we've made the haystack so big, no one's ever getting through the haystack to find the needle. What we really need to do is isolate the haystack into a group of suspicious people and spend enormous resources looking at suspicious people, people who we have probable cause. If you think of almost every instance, I mean, go back to 9/11. You'll have people come forward with the ridiculous assumption that if we had the Patriot Act, we wouldn't have had 9/11. They say, oh, we would have caught those 2 terrorists in San Diego. And I'm like, you mean the 2 terrorists that were living with a confidential informant for a year? We knew who these people were. They just weren't talking to each other. It wasn't a lack of gathering information. All this incidental and all this grabbing up of bulk records, that isn't what we needed. We needed the CIA to call the FBI. We needed further the FBI to call Washington and for somebody to listen to them. The 20th hijacker, a guy named Moussaoui, was captured a month in advance. We've got him in Minnesota. We've got his computer. He was captured because people said he was from a foreign country and he was attempting to learn to take off planes but not land them. The FBI agent there ought to be given a Medal of Honor. Instead of giving the Medal of Honor to the head of the FBI, we should have fired the head of the FBI, and this FBI agent should have been made the head of the FBI. He wrote 70 letters to his superiors. He caught the 20th hijacker. He should be a well-known name on every lip of every American and a hero. He caught the 20th hijacker. He saved lives, but his superior got 70 letters and did squat. I have no idea what happened to his superior, but nobody ever was fired for 9/11. Instead of firing the people who didn't do a good job, we gave them medals. The guy who did a good job, I don't know what happened to him. And what we did is we decided we'd just collect everybody's information, that we'd sort of scrap the Bill of Rights. I've met a lot of our wounded soldiers. I've met young men that have lost 2, 3 arms, 2, 3 limbs, 4 limbs sometimes. I've met people that are paralyzed. And to a person, when I ask them, what were you fighting for? They tell me the Constitution. They tell me our way of life, for our Bill of Rights. Don't you think they'd be disappointed to find out that they went over and they risked life and limb and gave up part of their bodies and they came home and while they were gone, we gutted the Bill of Rights? And not only did we gut it, and you can have a difference of opinion on this, but not only did we gut it, we don't have time to debate it. We just willy-nilly say, that's fine. Well, we're not even going to have time to debate it. We've known for 3 years this debate was coming up. And yet we squash a bunch of bills in the last week, and we've got no time for the debate, no time for amendments, no time to discuss whether or not we're willing to trade our liberty for security. Franklin said, those who trade their liberty for security may wind up with neither. This is a very important debate that we need to have in the public, in the open. We worry about, or some of us worry, that just in discussion of bulk records, we may not get to other programs the government just simply won't tell us about. A lot of them are written about, though. In another episode of the Electronic Frontier Foundation's newsletter, they talk about a program called Muscular. Muscular is a program that is siphoning off data between different data centers, like Yahoo and Google sometimes have, at least did have, communication between them that wasn't encrypted. Your information was encrypted going to the data center, but then between data centers they weren't encrypted, and the government's simply siphoning all this off through executive order. I don't know whether it's foreign, I don't know whether there's incidental American, I don't know what's being collected, and we have no oversight, no ability to vote on whether or not we continue this program or discontinue this program. The companies are sometimes not notified of the warrants, or if they are notified of the warrants, are told that they can't talk about them. They're gagged. This is the kind of stuff that we need to have in the open. Some of the information that people are talking about that the NSA collects on Americans are contacts from your address book, buddy lists, calling records, phone records, emails, and then they put it all into a data, and I think the program's called Snacks. They put it all into this data program, and they develop a network of who you are and who your friends are through all the interconnection of all your contacts and friends. And if you ask them, is any of this protected by the Fourth Amendment? The answer you'll get is the Fourth Amendment doesn't protect third-party records. So really, we're going to have this go to the Supreme Court. I said earlier that in the Olmstead case in 1928, Justice Brandeis is in the dissent. The vote is 6-3, I believe. And the court rules that phone conversations have no protection. So we started out with a bad history. Phone was just coming around and becoming commonplace. The Supreme Court said your conversations don't have any protection. This went on for 40-some-odd years until we get to the late 1960s, I think 1968, in the Katz case. And then they say there is an expectation of privacy. So that was a big blow for those of us who believe in privacy, that we finally decided your phone conversations are private and that you have an expectation of privacy and that it should take a warrant with your name on it, individualized, with probable cause. But we go another dozen years, 10 to 12 years, and we get another court case called Maryland versus Smith. And in it here, though, the court rules that your conversations are protected from the government, that the government has to have a valid warrant to look at your conversations, but they end up saying that your records don't, and that the government is allowed to eavesdrop and pick up and accumulate records about your phone calls without a warrant. I think this was a big mistake. Now, the case in Maryland versus Smith, though, is one sort of petty criminal and a few records over a few-day period. The question that I'd like to see before the Supreme Court would be, is that equivalent to all Americans' phone records all of the time? There was at least some kind of investigation going on of this person. They didn't do it the right way. I think they should have gotten a warrant. But in this case, what the government is arguing is that every one of you are somehow relevant to an investigation for terrorism. That's absurd. And finally, we get to the appellate court last week, and the appellate court says that. They say, frankly, it is absurd to say that everybody in America is relevant to an investigation. Not only is it absurd, not only is it a trifling with your privacy and your right to be left alone, but it takes our eye off the prize. Why do you think it is that there's not enough human analysts to know that Sinaref, the Boston bomber, was plotting to bomb the Boston Marathon? Why did we not know he got on a plane to go to Chechnya? One of the things that we were told, at least in the newspaper, was that he had an alternate spelling of his name. So we've been 15 years and we can't figure out that sometimes these names are spelled a little different, and we didn't know he flew back and was radicalized in another country. I'm for spending more money and more time on analysts to investigate and look at the data connected to people of suspicion. But I don't want to spend a penny on collecting all the information from all of innocent Americans and giving up who we are in the process. We have to fight against terrorism. We have to protect ourselves. But if we give up who we are in the process, has it been worth it? Are you really willing to give up your liberty for security? What if the security you're getting is not even real? They said the 52 people they caught through the bulk collection program, the president's his own privacy group investigated and said not one person was captured. A possibility of one, but they already had information on him from some other source. Under the executive order, we're still not talking about the Patriot Act. We're talking about something that nobody knows much about at all. No common member has been, to my knowledge, informed of what's going on under this program. None of those not on the Intelligence Committee. But they have something called, with this information, called the Special Procedures Governing Communications Metadata Analysis. This is allowing the NSA to use your metadata, phone records, etc., who you call, how long you speak, under the Patriot Act and Section 702 to create social networks of Americans. So not only are we collecting your data, because the government says, and realize this, many of your elected officials are saying this, that you have no right to privacy, and the Constitution doesn't protect your records. They're collecting all of your records, some of it incidental, but they're creating these enormous data banks. But then they're connecting metadata to other metadata to create social networks of who you are. You should be alarmed. We should be in open rebellion saying, enough's enough, we're not going to take it anymore. We should be in rebellion saying to our government that the Constitution that protects our freedoms must be obeyed. Where's the outrage? I tend to think young people get it. Young people, you see them, their lives revolve around their cell phone. They realize that if I want to know about their life, if I collect the data from their phone, not the content of their phone calls, but I collect the data from their phones, that I can know virtually everything about them. Do we want to live in a world where the government knows everything about us? Do we want to live in a world where the government has us under constant surveillance? Now, they'll say we're not looking at it, we're just keeping it in case we want to look at it. The danger is too great to let government collect your information. And I think there is a valid question whether or not simply the collecting of your information is something that goes against the Constitution. One of the other areas where we're seeing collection of data, I mean, it just would boggle your mind. We're not talking about just one program. We're talking about dozens of programs the government has instituted to look at your stuff. There's another group called EPIC, Electronic Privacy Information Center, and they talk about suspicious activity reports. These are reports that your bank has to file whenever you deal in cash at the bank. There's certain dollar limits. And they think, well, gosh, someone is probably a bad person if they're putting $9,500 in cash in the bank. Well, it turns out a lot of honest, law-abiding people do that. Not too long ago, there was a Korean husband and wife. They owned a grocery store. They dealt in a lot of cash, and they were very successful, and they deposited 3 times a day over $9,000, $8,000 to $10,000. They tried to stay under $10,000 because there was all kinds of extra paperwork if you were over $10,000. And so what the government said is, oh, you're structuring your deposits to evade the people. You must be guilty of something. The government then can accuse people of a crime and take their stuff. There's something called civil asset forfeiture. It doesn't require that you be convicted. It doesn't even require that you be accused of something. There was a story not too long ago in Philadelphia, Christos Sorovelos. And the teenager was selling drugs out of the back of the parents' house. So they caught the kid, and they were punishing him, but they decided they'd punish the parents too. So they confiscated the parents' house, evicted the family. So teenager makes a mistake selling drugs. What does the government do? They take the parents' house. You think that's going to help the kid or help anybody get better in this situation by taking the house? But here's the rub. Kid didn't even have to be convicted of anything. The kid didn't own the house. He was just their kid. if we allow all kinds of data to be out there to catch people, and then we're not even going to require that you're convicted of a crime before we take your stuff, you can see the danger of allowing so much data to be collected. But we are currently convicting and taking people's stuff or their money simply based on what they're using it for. The Washington Post did a series of articles on this. Turns out that most people having their stuff taken are poor, often African American, often Hispanic, but for the most part, poor. One guy was here in Washington, had $10,000, and he was going to buy equipment like a refrigerator or a commercial oven or something for his restaurant. They just stopped him and took his money. It took him years to get it back, and he only got it back because the Institute for Justice defended him in getting it back. But it turns justice on its head because he was basically considered to be guilty until he could prove himself innocent. Realize then that people like this are sometimes being picked up because of something called suspicious activity reports. Suspicious activity reports make your bank into a policeman or a policewoman. When you deposit things, they are obligated to report you to the police, to the government. Does it sound something like 1984? Does it sound like when you have informants out there everywhere, see something, say something, that your banker is going to call the government if you put cash into the bank? The burden should always be on the government to prove that you're guilty of something. You should never be convicted, you should never be punished without there first being a trial, without there first being evidence, without there first being a trial with a lawyer, with a verdict. Some of this has gone into the war on drugs. And the war on drugs has a lot of problems, but part of it has been the abuse of our civil liberties. But also part of the war on drugs has been that there's been a disparate racial outcome. What do I mean by that? There have been instances where, and if you look at the statistics, 3 out of 4 people in prison are black or brown for nonviolent drug use. But if you look at the surveys and you ask yourself, are white kids using drugs the same as black kids? It's equal. And white kids are 80% of the public. How did we get the reverse where 80% of the population in jail are black and brown? It's a problem, and if we can't figure it out, you're going to have to continue to realize why people are unhappy. If you want to know why there's unhappiness in some of our cities, you should read the New Yorker. About 3 or 4 months ago, they did a story about Khalif Browder. Khalif Browder is a 16-year-old black kid from the Bronx. He lived in a poor situation. His family had no money. He'd been in trouble before. But he was arrested, and he was sent to Rikers Island. 16 years old, arrested, sent to Rikers Island. His bail was $3,000. His family couldn't come up with $3,000, and he was kept for 3 years without a trial. At least some of it was in solitary confinement. He tried to commit suicide. Can you imagine how he must feel? Can you imagine how his parents must feel? Can you imagine how his friends feel, the kids he went to high school with? Do you think they think justice is occurring in our country? We have to be careful we don't let slip away who we are in the process of all of this fight against terrorism, all of this fight against drugs. Because what happens is people take things that are bad. Terrorism's bad, drugs are bad, but we take this fight about something that's bad, we forget about the process of law, we forget about the rule of law, and we forget who we are in the process. But if you want to know why people are unhappy in some of our big cities, you want to see that unhappiness in the street, it's because some people don't think they're getting justice. And I frankly agree with them. I think there isn't justice in our country when this occurs. Originally, we had the Constitution. Then after 9/11, we got the PATRIOT Act. The biggest change between the Constitution, which provided protection from us from people, bad people, was able to incarcerate people for 200 years or more. The biggest difference is we changed the standard on how we would arrest people or how we would give out warrants. And I remember having this debate about 3 years ago when we talked about the Patriot Act. I was walking along talking to another senator, and he was alarmed that the Patriot Act would expire at midnight. What would we do? And I was like, well, couldn't we for just a couple hours, live under the Constitution? I mean, we did for 200 years, for goodness sakes. We have all kinds of tools. There's almost no judge in the land that's going to turn down a warrant. The FISA warrants, the ones they give for security, it's 99.9% of them are approved. Couldn't we give out warrants? They say, oh, it takes too long. Computers work in the blink of an eye. In the blink of an eye, if John Smith is thought to be a terrorist and he called 100 people, in a blink of an eye, I can look at the 100 on the list and I can say, what is the evidence that some on the list looks suspicious? Or any of them from a foreign country, or any of them on another list from somebody calling from a foreign country. There are ways to look at this where we would simply then get a warrant for the next hop, and the next hop, and the next hop. There's no reason why we can't catch terrorists the same way we catch other bad people in our society by using the Constitution. Initially, the government had to show evidence that you were an agent of a foreign power, but this is no longer true. Now all you have to do is make a broad assertion that the request is related to an ongoing terrorism investigation. The problem in the FISA court is that when they take you to this court, it's secret, you don't get your own lawyer, and basically the government says to the FISA court judge, the government says, well, yeah, it's related to an investigation. But I don't believe they're forced to give information showing that it's related to the investigation. And in some ways, I think we've gone too far, because what you end up having is you have people who are saying it's related, but the question is there any evidence that there's a relation to it, and how could there be a relationship of everybody in America to an investigation? We also often have given gag orders, and this is one of the big complaints of the internet companies. They get order after order after order, national security letter, they get all of these suspicionless warrants, and then they're told they can't talk about it or they would go to jail. There are some people who got gag warrants that were librarians who for a decade or more were not allowed to talk to anybody to say that they'd gotten this warrant. The American Civil Liberties Union has written that the Patriot Act violates the Fourth Amendment, which says the government cannot conduct a search without obtaining a warrant and showing probable cause to believe the person has committed or will commit a crime. The ACLU goes on, though, to say that it violates the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech, by prohibiting the recipients of search orders from telling others. These are the gag orders. They also say that it violates the First Amendment by effectively authorizing the FBI to launch investigations of American citizens in part for exercising their freedom of speech. Now, they went back in and they wrote the rules and said, oh, you're not supposed to do it if it violates someone's freedom of speech. But the bottom line is that the opening that we've given to the intelligence community is so wide that there are, for all practical purposes, no limitations on the gathering of your information. In the Maryland versus Smith case, we kind of get to the point where we've said that telephone conversations are protected, but we've said trace and trap and pen register, where they collect your data about your phone calls, is not. The problem is, and this is a problem that needs to be corrected by the courts, at this point they're essentially non-existent. There are no protections in the court for any kind of warrant that has to be gotten for any kind of metadata. The FBI need not show probable cause or even reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. It must only certify to a judge, without having to prove it, that such a warrant would be relevant to an ongoing investigation. Also, typically in the past, when we gave warrants for wiretaps, they were sort of to entities. You kind of had to name the entity. But now we're giving the ability to collect data, pen, register, trace, and trap data on your phone calls nationwide. And this is a severe departure from what we had in the past, because typically warrants were given under a judge's jurisdiction, so within a region. But now we have a blanket order that says we can collect any of your phone records anywhere, any of the time, across the whole country. And this goes against the history of the way we've had jurisprudence. We talk a lot about phone data, but your emails are in there too. Interestingly, your emails, after 6 months, have no protection at all. So any email that you have on your computer after 6 months has no protection at all. Up to 6 months, there's a little bit of protection, but the government is able to look at, without a probable cause warrant, is able to look at who you're communicating with and the header on the subject line. The government is also able to look at, through metadata, the websites that you visit. You can see how that various groups would say that that might be an infringement of their First Amendment, because let's say the government now knows that I go to Electronic Frontier Foundation, or I go to EPIC, or I go to ACLU. I'm concerned with civil liberties. Am I a potential problem to the government? I'm concerned and I'm a critic of the government. Is it a problem that the government now knows what websites I go to and that I'm concerned with this? Now, if the government would hear, they would say, no, that's not what we're doing. But here's the other part of that question is, maybe not yet, maybe not now, but you can also squelch and severely restrict First Amendment practices if just simply the fear of the government looking at it is changing my behavior. There's already evidence, and there have been surveys saying that 25% of people doing things online are changing their behavior because they're afraid of the government. The government argues that the list of websites and websites addresses are simply transactional data. But I think that there's much more that you can garner from this data. The Patriot Act that is due to expire is just 3 sections. Interestingly, the complaints that I have are a lot over Section 215, which the government claims is their justification for collecting all of your phone records. Now, the courts have said otherwise. The appeal court last week said that the business records does not give them the authority to collect your records. In fact, the court has been very specific that it's illegal. The president is currently ignoring the court, and the president continues to collect your phone data, all of your phone data, all the time, as much as they can get. They've not changed any of their behavior that I know of since it was declared to be illegal. Some of the changes, I would repeal the whole thing. I would repeal the whole Patriot Act. But some of the changes that I would favor, if we were allowed to change it, if we could get a consensus in this body that would mirror the consensus that I think is in America. Once you get outside the beltway of Washington and you go back into America and you ask people, are they for this? The vast majority of people think the government shouldn't collect all of their phone records all of the time. But there are some changes we could make in this. I think the first thing we ought to do is not replace this system, but to basically say that we're not going to collect data in bulk, that we're not going to collect your phone records, your credit card information, your emails, where you go on the web. We're not going to collect that in bulk. I think we could change the Patriot Act to say we're only going to collect data that has to do with someone who's suspicious, that we have presented some suspicion to a judge and that the judge says there's probable cause. The standard's not that hard. It's hard for me to imagine, in fact, a judge saying no. Judges almost always say yes. If at 3 in the morning tonight there's a murderer inside a house in D.C., what do you think the odds are that when the police call for the warrant that the judge says no? Virtually non-existent. Most of us want the judge to give them permission. But it's the checks and balances that we want, so we don't have police who operate on bias or bigotry or religious discrimination. We want people to be bound by the rule of law. And it's kind of interesting because you'll hear Republicans sometimes give lip service to the rule of law. But in giving lip service to the rule of law, what happens is they seem to forget the whole idea of privacy. They're for it in economic transactions, but not so much with regard to personal liberty. The New York Times has written and talked about some of the economic effects of this. In an article by Scott Shane a couple of years ago, he talks about the idea that foreign citizens, many of whom rely on American companies for email and internet services, are concerned about their privacy. Now, you can say you don't care about foreigners, and they don't get the same standard as we get, and so you can understand maybe there's going to be a lower standard. But realize if we're going to say the standard is quite a bit different and that there are no protection for anybody's data on the internet, realize that that standard is going to scare people in other countries away from our stuff. It's going to scare people away from our email companies. It's going to scare people away from our search engines. And I think if you'll talk to any of these companies out there, and some of these companies are the greatest success stories in our country. You think of the internet revolution, and you think how America has really led this. America's been the leader in this. We've created, hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of profit, and in our zealousness to grab up every information, and in our zealousness to ignore basically the Constitution, we're grabbing up so much stuff, we're scaring people to death. There's already been billions of dollars lost to American companies because of this. Because Europeans, Asians, they don't want our stuff anymore. They don't want things with our hardware. They don't want to deal with our services because they're fearful that the U.S. government's looking at all their transactions. And the government's pretty clueless over this. Recently, one of the members of President Obama's administration came out, in fact, several members of them, and they're complaining about encryption. They're like, well, we're just going to have to maybe have some laws to prevent these companies from encrypting things. And it's like, don't you get it? Don't you get why companies, the encryption is a response to government. The encryption is a response to a government that's gone and run amok, basically collecting our information, collecting all of our information. If you're an American internet company, if you're an American search engine, if you're an American email company, what do you think you're saying? You're saying the only way I'm getting Europeans back, the only way I'm getting Asians back is to say that I'm going to protect them from my government. Isn't that a sad state of affairs? People say, well, how will you get terrorists if everything's encrypted? Edward Snowden was using an encrypted email server, and the company that was housing him, that was specifically the genre of their business. They had a business that was encrypted because some people want to be private for a lot of different reasons. Many of them legitimate, business, legal, personal reasons. But anyway, when they came to get Eric Snowden's email, they didn't ask just to get his email. They said they wanted the encryption keys for their entire business. See, this is the problem. You have to realize the zealots who don't seem too concerned with your privacy rights, imagine what they're going to do if they say to Apple, we don't want just the encryption or you to let us in one time to see John Smith, who we think is a terrorist. We want you to let you in all of our products. If they force a good company like Apple to do that, who in the world would want anything from Apple anywhere in the world? There is a danger that we will destroy great American companies by forcing this surveillance into their products. Senator Wyden has also made a good point. If the government is going to mandate backdoor access to the code source, and the government's going to say that Facebook or Google has to let them in a backdoor, that's a window. That's a breach of the wall. It's a breach of protection. And Senator Wyden and others have made a good point. He said, if you do that, you're actually weakening these companies to attacks of cybersecurity. Because if somebody can get in, somebody else who's smart can get in as well. So there is a danger to letting the government in. There are dozens and dozens of these programs. The NSA has something called the Dishfire database. Stores years and years of text messages from around the world, which might be fine, except for it ends up trapping people who are also American citizens as well. It ends up tracking and trapping purely domestic texts that are retransmitted outside the country. They have a program called TrackFin that collects and accumulates gigabytes of credit card purchases. I don't know, for some reason, I'm more appalled by the credit card purchases than I am the phone, because I think of all the stuff you can buy with your credit card and what it indicates about you. With phones, you can find out a lot with people's phone records. I mean, I think when the Stanford students looked at phone records, they found 85% of the time they could tell your religion by looking at your phone records. The vast majority of the time they could tell your doctors. The vast majority of the time they could tell what disease you had. Vast majority of time the government can then also connect you through social networking and tell an extraordinary amount about you. But with a credit card, it's even more explicit than that. They can tell, do you drink, do you smoke, how much, what magazines do you buy, what books do you read, what medicines do you take. All that's on your credit card. And we're more and more that society. We're less and less a society of cash and more the society where everything's on paper. That should worry us. It should worry us that the government has access to all of our records all of the time. It should concern us that the government also says, when you ask them, and this is an important point, that your records, when held by a third party, are not protected at all. Now, it's debatable whether that's true or not. I think it needs to be looked at again by the court. And I think there are those who will in the court say that your third-party records are. The Maryland decision was 6-3. Justice Marshall felt that your third-party records should be protected. He specifically mentioned that there was a potential stifling effect for association. There was a potential stifling effect for speech. And he was quite concerned that the government really should have a warrant to look at your records. My hope is that someday the Maryland versus Smith case is relegated to the dustbin of history in the same dustbin that we put Olmstead in. In Olmstead, they said you couldn't have any protection for your phone records. Went on for 40 years. I think we still live with some of that because we've trained and taught the phone companies not to be great advocates for your privacy. And there doesn't appear to be seen a great deal of fighting on the part of the phone companies in advocating for you. Some of the internet companies have begun to step up. But I'd like to see both phone companies and internet companies stand up and say, we're not going to do it. We're not going to give you access to us, and you're going to have to take us all the way to the Supreme Court. If we did, if there was unified resistance among the consumer and among the companies to say, we're not going to let you have our data without a fight, and that you're going to have to prove suspicion, and that you're going to have to get a specific warrant, I think then we might be able to get back to a more constitutional scenario. There have also been, within the NSA, evidence of installing filters in the facilities of internet and telecommunication companies, serving them with court orders and building backdoors into their software and acquiring keys to break their encryption. If this becomes the norm, you can see how people will flee American products, and people will say, I'm not going to use American things. There's an enormous, beyond imagination, economic punishment to our country that is occurring now and going to continue and worsen if we don't wise up and send a signal. So for those in this body who say, we need to collect more information, we're not getting enough information, warrants be damned, I don't care what they do, take all of my information, get as much as you want, those people will have to explain why they're destroying an American industry and why people around the world are going to say, we are alarmed at that and we want some protections. If we're going to use American products, if we're going to use American email, we want to know that there's not going to be indiscriminate collection of our information. Bill Binney was probably, or is probably, one of the highest ranking whistleblowers from the NSA. And the things he has to say should disturb us because he probably knows more about this than any of us will ever know. Bill Binney said that without new leadership, this is in our intelligence agencies, new laws and top-to-bottom reform, the agency, the NSA, will represent a threat of turnkey totalitarianism. The capability to turn its awesome power, now directed mainly against other countries, will now be turned on the American public. Originally, all of these intelligence forays were to get foreigners. And we lowered the standard saying, well, they don't live here. These are potentially terrorists, so we're going to have a lower standard. And they started out as foreign searches. In fact, the NSA was originally intended to search for foreigners and to search the information of foreigners. And I'm not opposed to that. In fact, I was on one of the Sunday morning programs this week, and they said, well, are you for eliminating the NSA? And I said, of course not. I'm for the NSA. I want the NSA to do surveillance that will help to protect us from attack. Not only am I for surveillance, I am for looking as deep as it takes. But I want some suspicion. I want suspicion that this person, this John Doe, that there's some evidence. You don't have to prove that they're guilty. You just have something that points towards them being suspicious. You go to the judge, and the judge says, here, if evidence of the people he called are suspicious, go back to the judge, get another warrant, go deeper and deeper. There's no reason why this couldn't be done nearly instantaneously. There's no reason why it couldn't be done 24 hours a day. And there's no reason why we can't have security and the Constitution as well. This battle has not been just about records. It's also been about another key part of the Bill of Rights, which is the right to a trial by jury, the right to due process, the right of habeas corpus. The Fifth and Sixth Amendment I see together as sort of the amendments that are with regard to your person and with regard to whether or not you're treated justly by your government. As we became fearful of terrorists, we said, well, we're just going to capture people and we will just hold them indefinitely. Now, it's one thing to catch someone on a battlefield in a foreign land shooting at us. And I've said repeatedly, people in battle don't get due process. But people outside of battle, particularly American citizens, should. But in some of these cases, we're talking about American citizens accused of a crime, perhaps terrorism, caught in our country, and we're going to say, well, they don't really deserve trials. They don't deserve lawyers. In fact, one senator said recently, and I find this really hard to believe. He said, well, when they ask you for a judge, just drone them. Ha ha. Same guy said, well, when they ask you for a lawyer, you just tell them to shut up. About 10 years ago, Richard Jewell was thought to be the Olympic bomber. Everybody said he did it. TV convicted him within minutes. Everybody said he was the Olympic bomber. He fit the profile. He wore glasses. He was an introvert, and he had a backpack, and he seemed real helpful. Somehow that was the profile. Everybody said he did it. The only problem was he didn't do it. So here he was accused of being a terrorist, of exploding something, doing something terrible, killing innocent people. And I think to myself, if he'd have been a black man in the South in 1920, what would have happened to him? Or if it had been any American in this century, if the people who believe in no jurisprudence were really in charge, we should be afraid of ever letting these people get in charge of our government. Because the thing is that Richard Jewell was innocent. People say, well, these aren't just American citizens, they're enemy combatants. And we don't give any kind of jurisprudence, no judges, no lawyers for these people, they're enemy combatants. Well, it kind of begs the question, doesn't it? Who gets to decide who's an enemy combatant and who's an American citizen? Are we really so frightened and so easily frightened that we would give up a 1,000-year history? Magna Carta, even before we had juries, even in the Greek and Roman times, we had juries. Are we really willing to give that up? Give people a classification that the government assesses them, cannot be challenged, people don't get a lawyer, they don't get presented to the judge and told why they're being held, and we would hold them forever? And the response I got during the debate over this was the debate over indefinite detention, the response I got was, well, yeah, we would keep them, we'd send them to Guantanamo Bay. An American citizen, sure, if they're dangerous. Kind of begs the question, doesn't it? Who gets to decide who's dangerous and who's not? When this finally made it to the Supreme Court, though, and whether or not you can hold an American citizen, the Supreme Court rejected the administration's claim that those labeled enemy combatants were not entitled to judicial review. Took years and years to finally have the Supreme Court tell people that the Bill of Rights was still in effect. That if you're an American citizen accused of a crime in our country, no matter how heinous, you do have a right to a trial by jury. You do have the right to a lawyer. You do have the right of habeas corpus. You do have all of the rights of an American citizen. And that no one can arbitrarily take those away from you. And if you don't think that that's potentially a problem, think of the South in the 1920s. Think of what would have happened if Richard Jewell were a black man in the 1920s. He might not have lived the day. Think if Richard Jewell had been a Japanese American during World War II, when we decided that the right of habeas corpus didn't apply to you if your parents were from Japan or if your grandparents were from Japan. There was an experiment, I remember, I think in college. It's a psychology experiment, and they put a patient or a person in a room, and they said, this person has information, and we're going to shock them just a little bit, and here's the dial, you get to decide. And they wanted to ask, how high would people turn up the dial? And it was pretty scary that a good amount of people that you would imagine are normal, respectable people, how high they would turn the dial to shock somebody or to torture somebody. See, we think that wouldn't happen, but it does. And anytime you make an analogy to horrific people in history, a Mussolini or a Hitler, people say, oh, you're exaggerating, you're talking about, it's hyperbole. And maybe it is, and particularly to accuse anybody of that is a horrific analogy, and I'm not doing that. But what I would say is that if you are not concerned that democracy could produce bad people, I don't think you're really thinking this through too much. And that if you're not concerned about procedural protections are how evidence is gathered, how evidence is taken from your house, what rules the police have to obey. And people don't quite get this. We don't have a mature discussion on this. Because anytime we try to say, well, this is to stop someone who could be a bad policeman, the media dumb it down and say, you're saying policemen are bad. No, it's the opposite. 98, 99% of policemen are good. In fact, of the general public, it's pretty close to that. But the thing is, you have the rules in place for the exception to the rule. And so you have these procedures in place because maybe it isn't tomorrow we decide that we're going to round up all the Japanese Americans again and put them in internment camps. But maybe next time it's Arab Americans. So the thing is, we have to be concerned with this because you don't know who the next group is that's unpopular. The Bill of Rights isn't for the prom queen. The Bill of Rights isn't for the high school quarterback. Least among us. The Bill of Rights is for minorities. The Bill of Rights is for those who have minority opinions. The Bill of Rights is those who are oddballs, those who aren't accepted, those who have unconventional thinking. But if we are so frightened that we're going to throw all the rules out and we're just going to say, here's my liberty, take it. Here are my records. I didn't do anything wrong, so I don't mind if you look at all my records. If you say the standard will now be, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear, look at everything I do, there will be a time and there will be a danger that in giving up your freedom, giving up your privacy, that you'll find that the world you live in is not the world you intended. There have been good folks within the National Security Agency who have talked about and have pointed out that we've gone too far. Bill Binney was one of those. He was a high-ranking NSA official who decided that they had gone too far. There was an interview, it's probably been a year or two, with Bill Binney that was in Frontline. One of the first questions was, what a lot of people in government will say is that you don't understand, we're still at war. Remember, we lost 3,000 people on 9/11. This is a very important program, talking about the warrantless collection of all our records. It has saved thousands of lives, as Cheney said at one point. There are multiple plots that have been stopped because of this program. You've got to be very careful about what you wish for, because if you do, you might have another attack. You might have blood on your hands. Fear. What is your reaction to this question about the effectiveness of what has been done? Binney replied, first of all, they like to lump it in as one program and say you can't cancel the program. In fact, Binney was famous because he had been working on a program that did investigate terrorists but protected American information and deleted American information from incidental collection. So he said it's false to begin with. It's multiple programs. The one program that dealt with domestic spying was called Stellar Wind. Stellar Wind was one that was created also by executive order and was done without the permission of Congress before the PATRIOT Act. They had the other foreign ones. You mentioned the names. There were other names that were listed in the PRISM program that were dealing with foreign intelligence. There were a whole bunch of these programs, not just one. So the point is that you stop the intelligence, the domestic intelligence program, period. So Binney's opinion was, and this is a guy who wrote a lot of the original programs, Bill Binney said he would continue gathering the information on foreigners. This is a guy who worked for 30 years for the NSA. He's not some dove who doesn't want to do anything about terrorists. Bill Binney worked for 30 years to develop programs that help us catch terrorists, but he felt like it wasn't proper or constitutional to collect Americans' records without a warrant. He said, if we get incidental records, destroy them. Don't collect them. He says, eliminate them. The records of Americans are irrelevant to anything that the incidental collection that is going on. all the terrorists would have been caught by the process that we put in place for Thin Thread. Thin Thread was a program that they had before they went to the unconstitutional program. It was looking in and focusing in on the groups of individuals that we already had identified and anybody in close proximity to them in the social graph, plus anybody. The other simple rules, like anybody that was looking at jihadi websites, etc., that would get them all. And you didn't have to do the collection of all this other data that requires all that storage, transport of information to the storage, maintenance of it, interrogation programs, all of that added expense that they're incurring as part of it over the last 10 years. You wouldn't have had to have any of that. Frontline then asks, this problem of haystacks, how big a problem is it? Is that what we've done? Is we've created a situation where the haystacks are bigger and it's almost impossible to find? This is Frontline's question. It's a question I've been asking also. If you collect all of Americans' records all of the time, if we collect all of your phone records, can we possibly look at them? Now, computers are getting better, but still there has to be a human involved. I think we're overwhelmed with the data. At one point in time, about a year ago, I remember an article where I think they'd collected millions and millions of audio hours. They've just been collecting. Everything, they're siphoning, they're vacuuming up everything. And I think they'd only been able to listen to about 25% of it. So the thing is that there is some information that we need to get and we should get. When the Sonarif boy, the Boston bomber, goes to Chechnya, we needed to know that. We needed to continue to see if there was evidence that we could take to a judge to continue to investigate him. So we do need surveillance, but what we don't need is indiscriminate surveillance, and we don't need the haystack to get so big that we can never find the terrorist in the stack. Vinny responds, well, what it means simply is you use the traditional argument, they say, we're trying to find a needle in the haystack. It doesn't help to make the haystack orders of magnitude larger because it makes orders of magnitude more difficult to find that needle in the haystack. Frontline. And is that what they've done? Have we made the haystack so large that we're actually having more trouble catching terrorists because we're scooping up and swooping up all of America's data? Benny, that's what they've done. And now they're looking at things like game playing and things like people doing that. I mean, this is ridiculous. How relevant is that to anything? Frontline. But they say they're computers, and in Utah, they're going to be able to take all this stored data, and they're going to be able to go through all of it, and they're going to be able to connect the dots. Connect the dots. That's what everybody wanted them to do after 9/11. Bill Binney, the former senior NSA, see, that's always been possible. Before 9/11, we were doing that. That was already happening. We already had that program. That wasn't an issue at all. That's why we should have picked this out from the beginning. We should have implemented it, this Thin Thread program that he'd already been working on, connect the dots, everything in the world, but we didn't. That's why we failed. It wasn't a matter of not having the program. It was a matter of not implementing what we had. When 9/11 came, we gave medals to the heads of our intelligence agencies. No one was ever fired. And yet the 20th hijacker was caught a month in advance. Moussaoui's caught in Minnesota for trying to take off planes but not land them. The FBI agent there wrote 70 letters to his superior trying to get a warrant. It wasn't that we had to dumb down and take away the procedural protections of warrants. The warrant wasn't denied. They'd have a much stronger argument if they could say, well, we tried to catch the terrorists, but the judges kept saying no to warrants. It's absolutely not true. They didn't ask the judge for warrants. So the 70 requests in Washington sat at FBI headquarters and weren't requested. You also had another hijacker in Arizona training to take planes off. Once again, the FBI agent there doing a great job in sending the information to Washington and people not talking to each other. It had nothing to do with saying the Constitution is too strong. We have to weaken the Constitution or we'll never catch terrorists. It had nothing to do with that. But that's precisely the argument we had. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Patriot Act was rushed to the floor. Several hundred pages. Nobody read it. Didn't come out of the, there was one out of the committee. They didn't use that. They rushed a substitute to the floor, and no one had time to read it. But people voted because they were fearful, and people said there could be another attack, and Americans will blame me if I don't vote on this. But we're now at a stage where we should say, are we willing to give up our liberty for security? Can you not have both? Can you not have the Constitution and your security? I think you can. Several agents other than Bill Binney have also said, several national security officials, that the powers granted the NSA go far beyond the expanded counterterrorism powers granted by Congress under the Patriot Act. The court now agrees with that. And anytime someone tries to tell you that metadata is meaningless, don't worry, it's just who you call, it's just your phone records, it's not a big deal. Realize that we kill people based on metadata. So they must be pretty darn certain that they think they know something based on metadata. Now, these are ostensibly or presumably terrorists that are being killed, but what I would say is that if they're killing people based on metadata, I would think you would want your own metadata pretty well protected. To give you an example of how representatives are sometimes getting it right, in the House of Representatives, they have seen and responded to the people. Thomas Massey and Representative Lofgren introduced an amendment to the Defense Appropriation Bill last year. This amendment would have defunded the warrantless backdoor searches, what they're doing through 702, which is an amendment to the FISA Act. This is where we say we're investigating a foreigner, but the foreigner talks to an American who talks to other Americans, and it ripples out into enormous amounts of incidental information. The information from 702, when you analyze it, 9 out of 10 bits of information that are collected are not about the person we've targeted. They're incidentally collected about other individuals. But when Representative Massey and Representative Lofgren introduced their amendment to defund the backdoor searches and to tell the CIA and NSA that they cannot mandate that companies give a backdoor entry into their product, the amendment passed 293 to 123. But just to show you that no good deed goes unpunished, and just to show you the arrogance of the body, the vast majority of people don't want their phone records collected without a warrant. But what did they do when this passed 293 to 123? They stripped it out in secret in conference committee, and it was, the reason it was gone is like everything else around here. You wonder why your government's completely broken? We lurch from deadline to deadline, and it's on purpose, really. We do deadline to deadline because it's in, gotta go. It's spring break. We're going to be late for spring break, and we've got to go, so we've got to finish this up before we go. It's how the budget is done. So no one ever votes on whether we're going to spend X or Y. They put the whole budget into 2,000 pages. Nobody reads it. It's placed on our desk that day. Nobody has any idea what's in it. None of your concerns about your government are ever addressed. We just pass, boom, the whole thing, and it's out the door. It's the same way with these kind of things. Because there's a deadline, and this amendment was passed, 293 to 123, saying that we shouldn't fund these illegal searches and that we should stop the bulk collection of records, it's passed overwhelmingly, and yet in secret, somehow it's taken back out of the bill and never becomes law. Now, while I don't agree completely, or really at all, with the reform that's come forward out of the House, it's at least evidence that they're listening. They have a bill that would end the bulk collection of records, but replace it with, I think, maybe another form of bulk collection. But it passed overwhelmingly, 330 some odd votes. But you know what you hear when it gets over here? They say the Senate is distanced more from the people and not as responsive. Absolutely true. And sometimes to the detriment of the public. Because the thing is that while it's overwhelmingly popular with the American people that we shouldn't be collecting your phone records without a warrant with your name on it, and the House has recognized this and passed something overwhelmingly to try to fix it, the first thing that I hear over here from people is, well, we're not collecting enough of your phone records. They're disappointed that the government isn't getting. They have access and they claim they gain access to everything, but the government's really not collecting all of it. So people over here are disappointed. They want to collect more. So the American people say, enough's enough. We want our privacy protected. We want the government to take less of our records. Congress recognizes that, the House of Representatives. Then it comes over to the Senate, and the Senate says, oh my goodness, we want to collect more of your records. We don't think we're getting enough into your privacy. We don't think we've completely trashed the Bill of Rights enough. Let's try to gain more of your records. One of the other things that the Massey-Lofgren Amendment did pass over there, was to get rid of and say that no funds would go to mandate or request that a person alter his product or service to permit electronic surveillance. Because, see, this is what's going on, and it is pretty nefarious and really, I think, antithetical to freedom, is that our government is telling companies like Facebook and Google and these other companies, they're forcing them to let the government have access into their product. Well, everybody knows this is going on. It's no secret, and it's killing these companies in their worldwide market because non-Americans don't want to use our email. They're afraid the government has forced their way into all their transmissions. There's currently another bill in the House put in by Representatives Pocan, Massey, Grayson, and McGovern that would repeal the entire thing, repeals the PATRIOT Act and FISA amendments of 2008, permits the court to appoint experts, permits the courts to have appeal, basically tries to make our intelligence courts a little bit more like an American court or American jurisprudence. EPIC is the Electronic Privacy Information Center. And they talk some about these national security letters that I mentioned earlier. National security letters, there are now hundreds of thousands of these. And these are letters that are not, they're warrants. They're not signed by judges. They're actually signed by the police. And this goes against sort of the fundamental precept of our jurisprudence. The fundamental aspect was that we divided police from the judiciary. And it's supposed to be a check and balance. In case the local policeman had some sort of bias, they always had to call somebody else. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than not having a check and balance. So when we got to NSLs, this comes out of the Patriot Act. They start out with a few thousand, they grow and grow and grow. Now there's hundreds of thousands of them. But realize that the national security letter is similar to what we fought the revolution over. We fought the revolution over writs of assistance, which are basically generalized warrants, but they were also written by British soldiers. And we were offended, you know, that a soldier would come into our house with a self-written permit. A lot of the reaction and the reason we wrote the Bill of Rights the way we did is that we were concerned with British abuses. We were concerned with the idea of general warrants. So when we wrote the Fourth Amendment, we said that it had to be specific to an individual. We said that you had to name the individual. And that's one of the real problems with the bulk collection of records, is that they're not really based on suspicion of an individual, because basically the government is collecting all of your records indiscriminately. The government's not even obeying the loose restrictions they put in place. So the Constitution says you have to have probable cause. You have to present some evidence to a judge. You don't have to prove that they're guilty, but you have to have enough evidence that the judge says, you know, it looks like that person could be guilty of a crime. So with the Patriot Act, we lowered that standard, and we then lowered it again. For collecting information under the Patriot Act, all you have to do is say that the information you want is relevant to an investigation. Well, when this gets to the court basically says this is absurd. So 2 weeks ago, the court just below the Supreme Court says it is absurd to say that every American's phone record is somehow relevant to a terrorist investigation. They said that it takes the meaning of the word relevant and basically destroys any concept that the word has meaning at all. So the Patriot Act went to a much lower standard, not probable cause, but just that it might be relevant to an investigation. And even with that lower standard, the court said, that's absurd. So the president, how does the president respond? The president responds by doing nothing. The president could end this program tomorrow. So every one of your phone records are being collected without suspicion, without relevance, in contradiction to even what the Patriot Act says. Your records are being collected. The second highest court in the land has said this is illegal, and the president does nothing. The president says to Congress, oh yeah, I'll do it if Congress will do it. Well, it's a bit disingenuous, Mr. President. You know, we didn't start the program. The authors of the Patriot Act had no idea this was going on. And the Patriot Act, according to the court, doesn't even justify this. So we're looking at telephone records. We're looking at email records. EPIC, the Electronic Privacy Information Center, has another big complaint about this, that people were put forward and then told that they couldn't even talk about the fact that they'd been given a warrant. They were threatened with 5 years in prison for even mentioning that they'd been served a warrant. This, I think, is an obvious contradiction to the First Amendment. So we have legislation that contradicts the Fourth and the First Amendment. The national security letters in 3 years, from 2003 to 2005, these are the warrants that are written by FBI agents, not written by a judge. There was 143,000 warrants given out in our country to Americans without a warrant, with a warrant written by the police. The New York Times has talked about this, and Charlie Savage, in a report last year, reported that the Justice Department had to apologize to a federal appeals court for providing inaccurate information about a central issue in a case challenging the constitutionality. Now, what is truth and what isn't truth? When you go to a court, it's like when your kids fight. There's two sides to everything. One child has one argument, and the other child's got the other argument. The truth is listening to both sides and trying to figure out what the truth is. The court is no different. But in these courts, you're only hearing one side. Only the government represents their case. So if the government says that we want all of the phone records because they're relevant, no one stands up on the other side and says, I object. That's one of the reforms that Senator Wyden and I have talked about, is having somebody represent the accused, somebody to stand up and say, maybe all the phone records in the country are not relevant. Maybe they're not relevant to an investigation. It would be absurd to say every American would be relevant, or that every American's records would be relevant. Probably no one in America knows more about this subject than Senator Wyden, who I see has come to the floor. Senator Wyden knows more about this because he's been on the Intelligence Committee for several years. And there's two tiers within Congress. There's a great deal of information that I am never told. Even though I was elected to represent Kentucky, I'm not allowed to know a lot of things that happens in the Intelligence Committee. Now, the downside for Senator Wyden is he's allowed to know more, but then he's not allowed to talk about it, which makes it a problem because it's hard to have dissent in our country. If I'm not given the information, how can I complain about it? And if he's given information and then not allowed to complain about it. So these are the things we struggle with in trying to find truth.
Would the senator from Kentucky yield for a question without losing his right to the floor?
Yes.
I thank my colleague and